I would like to start with a question. When did you actually realize that climate change is such a big issue, so important that you basically want to spend your life and most of your time on it?
I would have to. Well, first of all, thank you so much for interviewing me and for giving this opportunity. It's so lovely to be speaking with you. I've been following Global Citizen for years, and so this is exciting for me. I first realized that climate change was something of such importance that I needed to devote a huge portion of my time to when I was 15 years old. I was a youth delegate at that year's then G8 Environmental Summit. And I was meeting young people from the Maldives, from Bangladesh, from Indonesia, who were incredibly eloquent and passionate about the work that they were doing for their home countries. And it really clicked in my brain the importance of this issue when they told me about their personal stories of how they were struggling and adapting to this thing called climate change. And as soon as it had a human face, as soon as I could look into the eyes of my new friends and see that they were suffering, that their ways of life had been forever changed, that their family was affected, I knew that this was a lot bigger than just numbers on a page, and it was something that really was affecting the people around me and would have an effect on my future. And I guess it just kind of exploded out of control from there.
As you said, you were working on this film when you were really young. You started when you were 15 years old. Now you're 28. So, like throughout that time, was your like biggest inspiration, and what made you like really start this project and run it for so many years?
For me, I've always loved filmmaking and movies. I've always been drawn to storytelling as a way of understanding the world around me and of connecting to people that are different than myself. And as I was growing older and growing up, I realized the importance of stories and of film, particularly in its potential for bringing us together in a world that is so greatly divided. And this was something I held very fast to from a young age because I loved movies. Before I was even verbal, I loved watching movies and kind of being taken away into a visual way of understanding people around me. So when I was around 15 and I had been making films for a couple of years, and I was introduced to this concept of climate change, of the climate crisis, I felt that there was a gap in the stories that I was seeing. The majority of what I was seeing were older white men saying that we're doomed, that there's nothing really to be done, that it's too late. And it was sold to me in such a way that it was so overwhelming that it seemed like it had already been decided, the fate of so many people. And I couldn't live with that. I couldn't live with this sense that my future and my life was not only already affected and set in stone, but that the happiness and the health of so many young people that I knew and befriended around the world was also affected. And I very stubbornly kind of jumped into the fray and, thought I won't necessarily be chaining myself to a oil refinery, but I can go and film the young people that are doing that. And it became this 12-year journey of seeing this movement of young people around the world showing up to UN climate change conferences, showing up to local governments in their home countries, engaging with their communities, really trying to put across this story and this new way of thinking of the climate crisis, that it affects everyone, it doesn't know borders. And it's also potentially this great opportunity for us to change everything for the better. In order to adapt, in order to survive, we actually have to raise everyone up.
There's right now, unfortunately, no way around but to talk also about the corona crisis, because there seem to be similarities in both of these crises, but somehow politicians managed to react so much faster to this current crisis than to the climate crisis. Why do you think that is the case?
I think when it comes to COVID-19, to the pandemic we're all currently living in, that it's something that you can see and is tangible within everyone's life. It's affected everyone. It's affected the economy. It's affected society. It's affected, interacting with our friends and family. And it really makes you, okay, the difference is with climate change, you can say, oh, well, it's over there and it doesn't affect me. Do we actually have all the information? It's not going to affect me in my lifetime. And it's really easy for people to stay within the bubble of their own life. And with something like this pandemic, it's impossible to ignore it or to hide from it. And it's affected everyone, even the most affluent and countries around the world. I think that is mostly the reason why, I think, but also it's interesting over these past couple months of lockdown and quarantine, I can't help but think about how interesting it is. I mean, it's obviously a horrifying and overwhelming situation, but I can't help thinking how interesting it is that, we think of society as something that's fairly immovable and, it's very fixed. It's hard to move. It's hard to make things go quickly. We can see that, even with the climate crisis. It took over 20 years to, come to something that isn't even a legally binding deal between countries. But with the coronavirus, everything happened so quickly and people reacted very quickly because they had to. And it gave me a lot of hope because it's like, well, if we can move this fast for this pandemic, maybe we can do that with the climate crisis and, really for what's going to be coming, because we know that climate change is happening and it's only going to get worse. And if we can move this quickly with the coronavirus pandemic, maybe we can, I don't know, be in better practice for what's down the line.
So, so because that was but because that was basically my second question. You answered this already, so I just try to reframe it a bit. So, do you see any chance that this situation, this COVID-19 pandemic right now, might also help us? Do you have any hope that this will, help us in the long run with the climate change crisis?
Definitely. I am, amongst all of the anxiety and kind of feeling of overwhelm and being not in control of our lives that I know that most of us have been feeling in the quarantine and lockdown, one thing has kept coming back to me again and again, which is the sense of hope and optimism at how fast the world moved in order to respond to this crisis. Because we always think of society and the way things are as being very fixed and immovable. And with coronavirus, we had to change everything so fast because we had to. Because people were getting sick and people are dying and it's a pandemic. That's what you do. And if we were able to move that quickly within, weeks and months to adapt to this pandemic, it really gives me hope that maybe we can get our act together finally in regards to the climate crisis, because as we know, there really isn't a lot of time in order to adapt to it. And, we were running out of time 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And, maybe we're finally getting the strength and the ability to move quickly and realize that just because things have always been a certain way doesn't mean that they always have to be.
I was wondering, during the time you were actually making this documentary, you went to so many conferences, you interviewed so many politicians. You probably heard like the sentences and the promises over and over again. So after all that years, do you still have trust in politicians?
It's funny. I feel that there are people who enter politics for the right reasons. And at the same time, there are people who enter politics for the wrong reasons. And it becomes an exercise in power and an exercise in keeping themselves within that state of power. A lot of the politicians who I'm seeing that I actually do trust are people who don't come from that background, who are everyday citizens, who are artists, who are entrepreneurs, who realize that the status quo of how we're living isn't working, and that we don't have time to let politics change and the politicians who are in power change and adapt and become better leaders. Like, we need to replace them with people who can do the job now. So I have heard the same lines, the same sentences, the same sound bites over and over from politicians over the past 12 years. And it is really defeating at times and depressing, realizing that the majority of our leaders aren't these magical people who can just suddenly fix everything and have our best interests at heart. So I think what we're seeing now, and particularly when you look at things like the Black Lives Matter movement, and you're seeing this sense of people around the world kind of rising up and realizing their own potential and power, I'm really excited to see where that goes in rethinking our political system, because we need those kinds of people. We need that kind of out-of-the-box thinking if we're going to move forward and change the way that we live.
I feel like thanks to Fridays for Future and most recently also Greta Thunberg, there's like kind of a momentum right now that the climate change or the climate crisis is really present in the media for like a long time or for some years now. And I think the awareness in general is quite high. So what do you think do we need still as a young generation do differently or need to focus on to really make a change more than just awareness?
I mean, this is the million-dollar question of how do we make the next step from awareness to actual change? I mean, it's just to, as a side note, it is monumental seeing how we've gotten to this point where the whole world is listening to young people, particularly with, Greta Thunberg and young leaders who are finally, I guess, interesting enough for the media to follow. But there have been young people like Greta all along the way who have stood up and demanded change. But we're now in a period of time where we have things like social media and the internet are more prevalent, and we can connect and have this bigger network a lot more easily. Particularly, when I started, there was social media. There wasn't this sense of the ease of being able to connect around the world. So in terms of making the jump from just awareness to change, I'm hoping that we do figure that out, because it's something I don't think anyone has the answer to yet, because I think a lot of it has to come from people. They have to want to change. You can have people yelling at you all the time and you won't necessarily do it, but sorry, I'm just trying to think of how to not have such a terrible answer to give you. The jump from awareness to action, for a lot of people, they have to come to this sense of realization and understanding within themselves, because it is this weird kind of existential crisis of wondering what kind of people we want to be, wondering what kind of world we want to live in, because the way that it is right now isn't working. The way that people interact with each other right now isn't necessarily the best way we can live. So I think what we're seeing is that people are realizing that the way things are isn't working anymore. But going hand in hand with that, we need to take on, the people who have the most power and the most wealth and the most to gain from not changing and adapting to the climate crisis. So fossil fuel industry, the global industrial agriculture industry, like, we need to take the power away from the people who have broken the world, and we need to replace them, and we need to live in a different way. And that's hard and it's scary for a lot of people, which is why I feel, and a lot of young people like me feel, that if we can connect with people and show how living a different way isn't as terrifying as it seems, that, adapting and changing the way that we live is actually this really cool, exciting thing, I think we have a greater chance of changing things, and not just when it's, hitting us right in the face and there is no time, but, maybe with a little bit of having a bit more of a just transition for everyone. Did that make any sense?
It does, absolutely. I was also wondering, like, you are a voice in this scene for so many years, and you are fighting this battle for so many years. So obviously there were moments where you were probably frustrated, but I hope there were also moments of success. So what were the moments and the situation where you felt you really, made a change?
Like you say, there have been many, many moments of frustration and of feeling like so much energy and work. I mean, even just me personally as a filmmaker making this film within this space of just seeing how time and time again, either whether it's young people or whether it's indigenous communities are just going up to the bat again and again and not being listened to or not being taken seriously or ignored or, pushed out of the way. It's frustrating to see time and time again that our world leaders choose the easier way to do things instead of the best way and the right way to go about adapting to this crisis is really defeating. There were many times when I thought my movie was done. One of them was when the Paris Climate Accord was put into place, but it didn't really feel right because it wasn't legally binding. It didn't feel like the best kind of outcome. Another time was when Trump got in, because that felt like, just taking a hammer to everything and just having it explode into a million pieces. But I think one of the things that is most important to me and has been one of the greatest successes, I think, is how young people, how our generation are truly coming together in a different way than previous generations. They're truly embracing each other and the sense of community and of an identity that is based on coming together and inclusiveness and equality and justice and fighting for what's right. And that's something that I see in my Q&As after my film screenings, or back in the days of when we had film screenings, of young people really, they get it. And seeing how quickly they respond to it and how they understand how this fits into and affects their life is so gratifying. And, seeing climate vulnerable nations say, you know what, I'm changing now because I know that I don't have the money of, one of the more affluent countries, but I'm going to do it now, is also extremely inspiring. There are many dark nights of the soul. I wish someone had told me when I started out that that's the way it was going to be, that it wasn't like, oh, you have one dark night of the soul and then everything's fine and you're going to be this superpower fueled person who can just keep going and going and going. It is hard, and there are a lot of moments of frustration and of feelings of defeat because we're essentially, in order to adapt and survive, we have to dismantle so many existing systems, and it's really hard, and not everyone wants that to happen. But I think we're getting there, and that gives me inspiration and that gives me hope, because I think, the change is there. And even if we don't get there, so many people around me are like, you know what, I want to be the person that would live in that world, regardless of what happens. And so that's the, I think, biggest feeling of hope for me is feeling that I'm not alone and that I'm part of this greater movement of people that, do see change and are willing to embrace it in each other.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Coming to my last question, what would you advise others, and especially young people, to do? So what is your message, basically? Why should we become a climate activist?
Why you should become a climate activist? Because in a way, there really is no other option. in my opinion anyway, and in the opinion of a lot of my friends in the movement, because this is happening. The climate crisis is happening. And we live in a world that is changing, whether we want it to or not. And so by becoming a climate activist, I feel like in a lot of ways what that means is understanding where we are as people and understanding where we are within the climate crisis, and that we don't have a lot of time left, and that it is urgent, and that people are suffering and dying around the world. It's having that awareness and being able to find a place for you to work within that space, even though it can be hard and overwhelming. But what you get out of it is this sense of community and this feeling that, the world that we've always dreamed of is actually possible. A world that is caring and just and sustainable, where we all have clean air and fresh water, better jobs, and more innovation is possible. That's really exciting. And there's a lot of different ways to work within that space, whether it's the arts or policy or law or whatever. It has been one of the most exciting and influential things in my life, because I feel like regardless of what happens, that I did everything I could and that I had a positive effect on the people around me. I want to feel that, I didn't just know about something and did nothing, but that, I can live with myself.
Thank you so much for the interview. That was really inspiring.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I hope it wasn't too rambly.